Dear students, welcome to the IR classroom and welcome to my YouTube channel, Easy Learning. You'll find most of the information on this channel. I'll try to segregate the information according to the modules. So today we're going to speak about what international relations is and what are the main components of it. So we are going to take the learning objective A1, understand the basic framework of international relations used to understand the current issues. We're going to go through some definitions, or else you will have to note down the definitions as long as you're going through the worksheet assigned to this particular slide. Then we're going to try and understand what is international relations in terms of field of studies, what are the main principles or rules of international relations, and what is levels of analysis approach in international relations. So the following words, you have to grasp them by the end of the current lecture. So international relations, principle of dominance, reciprocity, identity, collective goods problem, and levels of analysis approach. So what is basically IR, right? You might actually find many definitions of IR. I have selected two of them. So IR might be defined as a study of relationship and interactions between countries, including the activities and policies of national governments, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and multinational corporations. We're going to study the actors of IR a little bit later. Or else you might want to say that international relations concern the relationship among the world governments, but these relationships cannot be understood in isolation. They're closely related to their actors and with geographical and with our social structures and processes, as well as the geographical and historical influences. So these elements together would actually explain the globalization idea as well. So what would be IR as a field of study, right? Basically, IR has been established in 1919 together with the Department of International Politics at University of Wales. And the most important factor that influenced the decision of creating IR as a field of study was the end, or let's say was the First World War. So basically at that particular moment, both governments and scholars were trying to understand what would be the reasons for such a major event as World War I and how could they avoid a Second World War to happen. Okay, and what would be some ways to prevent global conflicts. International relations can be both theoretical and practical, or it can be a policy subject. The academic approaches to it can be either empirical or applicative or normative, theoretical. International relations is a multidisciplinary subject, therefore it is connected with political studies, it is connected with history, it is also connected to economics in terms of international economics. You can also find they are very close to law in terms of public international law, humanitarian law, or international law itself. And of course, IR is connected to philosophy in terms of international ethics. IR perspective also covers the idea of regionalism. So basically, the scholars might also focus on different regions. And for example, some scholars might actually focus on Latin American studies or North American studies. You might also find scholars that would study only the Middle Eastern, the issues in the Middle East or Africa. We have two major schools of IR. Okay, so there is basically an ongoing debate whether IR is still purely American field of study, where US is the dominant power in international relations and still maintains the unipolar world system, or is still a major actor of IR, or basically IR is or let's say the focus of IR as a field of study has shifted, and along with the development of European Union and the post-colonial states, the power and decision-making shifted towards a multipolar world system, where there are more actors of IR that would participate in the international affairs. So this is a continuous debate, of course, given different sources, you might actually find different perspectives on it. What would be the main principles of international relations, or what would be the main rules of international relations? If you want to understand what international relations work with, we might actually want to look back into the main principles included in Charter of United Nations in 1945, as well as the UN Declaration of Friendly Relations in 1970. So basically, all the states are to follow the following rules or principles. All the states have to ensure a sovereign equality of other states, non-intervention in internal and external affairs of other states, prohibition of the threat of or use of force, peaceful settlement of the disputes, and self-determination of people. So basically, when it comes to the principles or rules which IR as a field of study would set, we can say that IR principles of IR are as following: fulfillment of obligations in a good faith and duty of states to cooperate with one another. So basically, IR is pledging for or to ensure that the major principles included in Charter of United Nations are also followed at the level, or let's say, while discussing or researching in IR. Now, of course, if we're talking about the principle of reciprocal help, or principle of working together as in a collective manner, we have to mention the principle of shared interest, or the collective goods. Basically, the collective goods would mean that the actors of international relations, or states, non-state actors, intergovernmental organizations, would try to provide something that benefits all the members of a group, regardless of what each member contributes to it. So collective goods would be easier to provide in small groups rather in large groups, because in small groups the phenomenon of cheating is way harder. So this is why you might actually have noticed that, for example, United Nations have different agencies that are responsible for certain area, and they are tackling certain problems. For example, let's say the United Nations Security Council works mainly with the issues like with the conflicts, or let's say you have the UN peacekeeping missions. They're mainly focused on ensuring the peaceful resolution of certain conflicts in a particular area. Okay. Collective goods problem in small groups has a greater impact on an overall collective good, for the simple reason that it's easier to achieve a target if you are working on a smaller area rather than to achieve a target when you have to take into consideration multiple factors. And of course, when you're working in smaller groups, it's easier to punish when you see that the group is actually not following what they promised. So the advantage of small groups helps to explain the importance of power system in international security affairs and the G20 industrialized countries in economic matters, because those 20 industrialized countries are basically working towards the idea of globalization and industrialization, and are a major driver of how the economic system works. Now, of course, the principle of shared interest would have, or let's say, would involve three basic rules to the problem itself. Okay, so basically, the principle of shared interest or the collective goods will offer three different solutions or three different ways in which actors can cooperate for the common good without a central authority to make them do so. One way to make different actors to cooperate for a common good is the principle of dominance. The second way of making individuals or actors to cooperate is the principle of reciprocity. And the third way of making individuals or actors to cooperate is the principle of identity. So, principle of dominance. Principle of dominance will solve collective goods problem by establishing a power hierarchy. What does it mean? It means that there will be a top control of those that are at the bottom, or let's say there will be one major power that is going to control all the other states that would be weaker in sense of their security, in sense of their governmental control, economic development, and so on. So when the social conflicts such as who gets resources are resolved, automatically in favor of the highest ranking actor. So fights over the dominance position have scripted rules that minimize to some extent the harm inflicted on the group members. The top actor might be the most adept of forming and maintaining alliances among the groups that of the more capable members. Dominance itself is a complex and not just a matter of brute force. So basically, dominance is going to involve both rogue power and the soft power. In international relations, the principle of dominance underlines the great power system in which a handful of countries dictate the rule for all the others. Sometimes the so-called hegemon or superpower stands atop the great powers as the dominant nation. For example, in 19th century and beginning of 20th century, Great Britain was one of the most dominant countries in the world in terms of their military power. After the end of the Cold War in 1990, US became one of the greatest power and was considered one of the greatest power up to the point of, or up to the moment of 9/11 attacks. So another example would be the UN Security Council, in which the world's 5 strongest military powers hold a veto, and that actually reflects the dominance principle. So as you might know, the United Nations Security Council includes the great, or let's say the so-called Great Five, and those are Great Britain, US, China, Russia, and France. Right, so in this case, we are going to basically, or let's say all the other nations, or all the other nations are able to be elected for a term of 3 years as part of the United Nations Security Council, but they do not have the right to veto. Or let's say, if US does not really like a certain decision and thinks that this decision might actually harm its security, they might actually impose a veto on it. We are going to speak more about it later on, and we will have specific examples on how exactly this principle of dominance works like. The principle of reciprocity will solve the collective goods problem by rewarding the behavior that contributes to the group and punishing the behavior that would follow a self-interest at the expense of the group. So in this case, we can say that reciprocity is way easier to understand than dominance, and it can be enforced without a central authority. So if we noticed in the principle of dominance, we basically had a group of powerful countries that would impose their opinion or impose their power over the rest of the countries. In case of principle of reciprocity, there is no need for central authority to control or to enforce this principle. It makes individuals to cooperate for a common good. The disadvantage of this particular principle is that it can lead to a downward spiral, as each of the side punishes what it believes to be negative acts by the other. So for example, let's assume that we have the issue of environmental problem, right? So and let's say three countries are trying to figure out some solutions at their borders. So basically, if they don't really like a behavior of one of their partners, they might actually impose sanctions, or they might punish them. So in IR, reciprocity forms the basis of the most norms, the habits, the expectations, and the institutions in the international system. We are going to speak about in norms and institutions when we will study the theories of international relations. The idea of norms and institutions is broadly discussed as part of the liberal and constructivist perspective, and we're going to work on it more. So in case of principle of reciprocity, we might actually mention WTO or World Trade Organization agreements, which basically recognize reciprocity as the essential of cooperation. So for example, if one country opens its markets to another's goods, the other opens its markets in return. On the negative side, the reciprocity fuels arms race, as each side responds to the other's buildup of weapons. But it also allows the arms control agreements and other step-by-step conflict resolution measures. So basically, each side is trying to not only serve as a competitor, but also to back each other up in case of conflicts or conflictual situations. Another principle of IR is the principle of identity, and the identity principle involves identities of participants as members of a certain community. So what does it mean? It means that if in case of dominance and reciprocity act on the idea they will act on the idea of achieving self-interest. Identity community care about the interests of the others in that particular community, which would be enough to sacrifice their own interest to benefit the others. So the roots of the principle of this principle lies in family and the extended family and the kinship group. In IR, identity communities play an important role in overcoming difficult collective goods problems. For example, World Health, UN peacekeeping missions, etc. So For instance, Scandinavian countries, even though they are neutral as of their military interests, they actually actively participate in foreign aid, same as Canada. And then, on the other hand, non-state actors, such as non-governmental organizations or terrorist networks, also rely on identity politics to great extent. So, in the latest 20 years, the role of the non-state actors actually increases. So basically, we have feminist organizations, churches, jihadists, and multinational corporations, for example, that have brought identity principle to a greater prominence in the IR theory in recent years, and that actually shapes IR as a field of study and shapes the international politics in terms of the necessity for the states to take into account not only the state interest but interest of the non-state actors as well. Some advantages and disadvantages the advantages of the IR principles. So basically, you could summarize the previous slides and say that the advantages of principle of dominance would be that it ensures order, stability, and predictability, for the simple reason that you have a certain group of powerful states or one single state that is able to control from the military, economic, and political perspective all the other actors of IR. On the other hand, a negative impact of it would be the oppression, like the use of force to achieve their goals. Then the principle of reciprocity will, from advantages, we could mention incentives for mutual cooperation. So basically, all the I would say all the actors that participate in a certain agreement actually have incentives out of it or have certain benefits out of it. And again, we are going to discuss about a principle of reciprocity as part of the constructivist and liberal perspective, and you're going to understand more about it. The negative impacts would be the downward spiral, or else, let's say, those that are at the top will benefit more rather than those that are on the bottom. The identity principle would include such advantages like sacrifice for a certain group, redefinition of interest of a certain group, for example, the rights of women, or maybe, let's say, having more, or let's say increasing the role of women in politics, etc. Whereby the disadvantages would be the idea of demonizing an outgroup, or considering a certain group of a society, an ethnic group, as something that would bring a lot of negativity or does not belong to a certain area. For instance, the Rohingya ethnic group in Asia would be one of the good examples here. So you might want to read the case study that is included in your worksheet and try to identify how can the problem of nuclear proliferation be solved from the perspective of dominance, reciprocity, and identity as principles of IR. So the scholars of IR have developed an approach to analyze the actors of international relations and the processes of international relations by using the levels of analysis approach. So levels of analysis approach is a perspective of IR based on a set of similar actors or processes that suggest possible explanation of why questions. We will talk about 4 levels of analysis. Initially, there were 3 levels of analysis. Later on, the IR scholars added an extra one. So there are major, there are major 3 levels of analysis, which is individual, domestic, and interstate. And lately, we can speak about a global level of analysis, which basically analyzes all the processes and actors that are not related inherently towards the domestic or international politics between the states. So let's see how it works. If we're talking about an individual level of analysis, it will concern the perception, choices, and actions of individual human beings. At this level of analysis, you're going to discuss different leaders, thinkers, voters. So, for instance, if a few more college students had voted Nixon rather than Kennedy in the 60s, the Cuban crisis might be and a different, okay? If we are talking about the foreign policy decision making, we are going to analyze foreign policy decision making mainly at the individual level, because we are going to take into consideration the psychological factors of those leaders that participate at the individual decision making, at the decision making process. Sorry. At domestic level, you are going to analyze, or you're going to look into relations of individuals within the states that influence state actions in the international arena. So, for example, you're going to look here into the interest groups, political organizations, and governmental agencies. These groups operate differently in different kinds of societies and states. So, in democratic states, you're going to have less pressure on these particular groups. In authoritarian states, you might actually see that this particular actors are not as active. So basically, within governments, foreign policy agencies often fight bureaucratic battles over policy decisions, and we are going to discuss this in details in Module E. Interstate level concerns the influence of the international system about outcomes. So this level of analysis focuses on the interactions of the states themselves, and they are not going to look into their internal structure or internal political system. This level pays attention to states' relative power positions in international system and the interactions, trade, for example, among them. We could say that, we'll say in the IR tradition, this particular level of analysis, or the interstate level of analysis, has been one of the most important. Lately, or let's say after the 9/11, especially after the 9/11 events, levels of analysis have been extended, and the scholars of IR are now discussing about the global level of analysis, which is trying to explain international relations in terms of global trends and forces that transcend the interactions of states themselves. So basically, the evolution of human technology, certain worldwide beliefs, and human relationships to natural environment are all processes at the global level and influence international relations, and are often not really depending on the state-to-state relations or the internal makeup of the states. The global level focuses on studying transnational integration through worldwide scientific, technical, and business communities, as well as the global influence of historical European imperialism. So basically, post-colonial studies are going to focus on this particular level of analysis. The global level of analysis is going to also be strongly related to the process of globalization itself. Thank you very much for your attention. This was the Learning Objective 1. I hope you all enjoyed this session, and don't forget to work on the assignment attached to this particular slides, and enjoy.